Whew. Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. I have to stand somewhat close to this because I think I need to project into this microphone so the folks at home can hear me as well. So hello to everyone at home or wherever you are. Glad you're joining us on this occasion too. So you're here. There's a great turnout. I'm super happy to see all of you here to talk about wisdom. I'm not surprised that this topic interests people. It's interested people for millennia. Our earliest literatures have texts about wisdom, usually about how to live a virtuous life, how to be dutiful, how to be closer to God in some cases. So this has been a perennial question that people ask: what is wisdom and how to be wise? Situating it in that really broad landscape, this is just my little piece of that wisdom literature, which I look at from a psychological perspective. And as Esme said, I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Klagenfurt in Austria. I should probably say not currently. I technically start on January 1st, but I've been doing research there for a while and started researching in Austria in 2014. Came back here to finish my PhD and now heading back to Austria to pursue this research area further. We have about 50 minutes together. I'm going to be dedicating a portion of that time for discussion at the end. I do have some questions for you as I present, but if you have any questions as I go along, please feel free to ask those, especially if there's something that is unclear. And it's very likely that I may say something unclear. So please just ask for clarification or share a comment. Absolutely acceptable and encouraged. So with that, and before, okay, I hit the next button. Let's go that way. Before we begin today, I have a problem that I need your help solving. Someone has asked me for advice, but I don't know what to say or do. And here's the problem. A 15-year-old girl wants to get married right away. What should I consider and do in this situation? This is the audience participation part. So, yes, in the back. You, yeah. Sorry, I don't know your name, I'm sorry.
Are we allowed to ask you questions?
No. But what questions would you ask?
I would say, what are you to this 15-year-old girl in your relationship?
Okay. No. I'll tell you why after, but if you have questions or information that you'd like to know, unknowns, voice them. Okay, Michelle?
Ask her why she wants to get married right away.
Why she wants to get married right away. Pune? Okay, what are the circumstances surrounding this decision or this situation? What does it mean to her? What does marriage mean to her? Yes. The person.
I would ask her that. Like who she's married.
Who is she marrying? Who is this person that she wants to be married to? Yes. Can you say a little bit more about that?
I don't know if she's able to give consent, and maybe she's being coerced. That may be an issue that's beyond, talking to or inquiring about motives.
So exploring issues of consent, coercion, exploring motives. Further? Yes.
What are her plans and future goals in life?
Okay, what are her plans and future goals in life, and how might getting married now fit within that scheme? Yes.
Is she in love?
Is she in love? What is her emotional sort of space going into this? That might speak to the coercion piece as well too. Pune?
Her cultural background, maybe a norm in her culture.
Okay, where is she coming from? Perhaps the culture that she's from, getting married at 15 is average or common practice. Okay, thank you very much for your advice. That was very helpful. This is actually an example of an ill-structured life dilemma that we use to assess people's wisdom. So part of why you're here today might be to ask, what is wisdom? And how the heck can you measure something like wisdom? which seems so unreachable and untouchable and extraordinary. Well, this is one way in which we do that. We present people with these life dilemmas that don't have a clear solution, and then we score the life dilemmas for certain criteria that are indicative of wisdom. So here are a couple responses that were collected in Germany in the 1990s when this particular approach began. Here's an example of someone who scored low on this measure of wisdom. These are abbreviated responses. Usually the responses are much longer. A 15-year-old girl wants to get married right away. No, no way. Marrying at age 15 would be utterly wrong. Someone has to tell the girl that marriage is not possible. After further probing, it would be irresponsible to support such an idea. No, this is just a crazy idea. The high wisdom scorer said, well, on the surface, this seems like an easy problem. On average, marriage for 15-year-old girls is not a good thing, but there are situations where the average case does not fit. Perhaps in this instance, special life circumstances are involved, such that the girl has a terminal illness, or the girl has just lost her parents. And also, this girl may live in another culture or historical period. Perhaps she was raised with a value system different from ours. In addition, one has to think about adequate ways of talking with a girl and to consider her emotional state. Do people have any reactions to these different responses? Yes.
Change one little thing. A 15-year-old girl wants to have an affair with her teacher. On the surface, seems like an easy problem. Most that's not a good idea, but there may be some special circumstances. Maybe a good guy. She's very emotionally distraught. Maybe she knows other girls who have affairs with you. So.
Yeah, and so the way in which wisdom would be measured in these responses is not really ultimately what the outcome is or whether she should or shouldn't do it. It's more about the pieces of information that are considered in that decision-making process. So everything that you're saying right now is relevant to the ultimate decision. We would need to know all of those circumstances, and there is no absolute answer. It's contingent on the circumstances. And that's reflective of how a wise person would evaluate the situation. When I first read this high wisdom response, I was amazed at the pieces of information that were considered. It didn't even cross my mind to consider that this was a situation in a different historical period and how the norms surrounding marriage have changed. My mind didn't even go there. My response looked much like the first response. It just seemed like an irresponsible thing to do. So when I first was introduced to the individual differences in people's responses, I was really taken by what are the factors that contribute to the second perspective as opposed to the first. So to introduce the science of wisdom, as I have already mentioned, our first literate societies produced wisdom texts. This is an ancient concept, but only in recent years, in the last 37 years precisely, have psychologists, lifespan psychologists like myself, been asking questions about it from a scientific perspective, aimed primarily at definition, measurement, what are the correlates of wisdom, how do we enhance it in our society, which very clearly needs more wisdom. So experts agree that it is a rare and extraordinary form of psychological maturity. It integrates a number of different attributes, personality traits, cognitive abilities, emotional regulation strategies, and awareness and knowledge, motivational attributes, our concern about doing well for others. So it's there's a constellation of attributes that comprise this characteristic, we could call it. Researchers also agree that it's very complex as a result and hard to measure. We generally have the sense of wisdom when we see it in our environment, but producing a systematic way to study that is a little bit more challenging. And as a result, no single theoretical model has prevailed. There still is quite a bit of disagreement in the field, and it's been my practice as a result to measure wisdom in multiple ways to get maximum coverage. Just before we go there, what are some attributes in your minds that define wisdom? What are characteristics of a wise person? Just based on your own theory. Yes?
Well, somebody who doesn't see things in black and white, who's willing to get below the surface and understand what people's motivations are.
Perfect. So some cognitive complexity there, maybe a relativistic thinker, a dialectical thinker, someone that sees the shades of gray in life.
Our society is getting more and more away from that.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, and I think on average that is quite rare to actually think in those complex terms. It's a scary place, actually, when you see the world through that lens. There's a lot of uncertainty, which is why people, I think, avoid. It's nicer and neater and more predictable when things are absolute. Pune? Wise people are self-reflective. What else is wisdom? Or what other attributes do wise people have? Empathy, they're empathetic. Yes.
They're learners, ongoing learners.
They're ongoing learners, lifelong learners. They're constantly seeking knowledge. Part of that is knowing the limits of our knowledge and questioning what can be known, knowing that knowledge changes. A lot of people have argued that wise people are intellectually humble in that way. They know that they don't know, but still pursue knowledge.
I think it's someone who's able to assess the situation, weigh the pros and cons, and come to give good advice.
Okay, they can assess the situation, weigh the pros and cons, and give good advice. That behavior, advice giving, is strongly associated with wise people. When everyday people are asked what wisdom involves, across studies, these are the sort of 5 attributes that are reported. They're cognitively able, or they have advanced cognitive abilities. They're insightful, they're reflective, they're compassionate, and they have real-world skills. And here are some further, more specific terms that fall in each of those bins. When we asked people in a study that I conducted who was wise in terms of cultural historical figures, this is the list of the highest frequency wisdom nominees. At the top, these are Americans and Canadians reporting this across the lifespan. So from ages 18 to 97, I believe, was our oldest participant. The greatest exemplars of wisdom in their mind were Mahatma Gandhi, Jesus Christ, Abraham Lincoln, and Martin Luther King Jr. When we later asked people to take these 13 exemplars and compare how similar they were to one another using a questionnaire, and then put that information into a statistical software to see if the exemplars clustered in any systematic way, we found that underlying these exemplars were 3 prototypes of wisdom. So there are, as it turns out, possibly many ways to be wise. And we labeled those clusters practical wisdom, benevolent wisdom, and philosophical wisdom. And perhaps at the center of those is the paragon of wisdom, the most prototypically wise person. Although we need to pursue that and question that further, whether or not it's possible to integrate these and how they're integrated. Certainly there are examples of people who integrate the benevolent and the practical wisdom prototypes because they're doing good in the world and they have the strategic knowledge in order to achieve those goals. In this study, we had hypothesized that older people would be more likely to rate an exemplar from the benevolent category, given concerns about generativity and promoting the welfare of future generations. But as it turns out, there were no age differences in the prototype that was nominated. So those are a couple slides discussing what everyday people think wisdom is. Of course, experts in the field have also proposed models defining and operationalizing wisdom. It's been, some people measure wisdom using self-report questionnaires. Monica Ardelt is an example of someone who's designed a questionnaire that measures cognitive, reflective, and affective or compassionate aspects of wisdom. And this is a questionnaire that I use in my research. I also use the approach that you saw at the beginning of this presentation, which was designed by Paul Baltes in Berlin, and it's known as the Berlin wisdom paradigm. Wisdom here is defined as a form of cognitive expertise, which is defined as experience-based knowledge, skill, and judgment in the domain of fundamental life matters. And usually it's scored in a think aloud type response that you had tried out earlier today. Here, there are, just to give you a little bit more information as to how we would have scored your responses to this dilemma, we would have looked for evidence of, in your knowledge or in your response, of rich factual knowledge, rich procedural or strategic knowledge, so you know a lot about life or that domain, marriage in this case, and also you know how to manage a situation like the one presented to you. That we also look for meta criteria, which concerns value relativism, contextualism, and the acknowledgement and management of uncertainty. So according to this model, these are characteristic of what they call wisdom-related knowledge. Concerning the development of wisdom, though, which is where my research area is focused, I'm very interested in this idea that when you ask people how one becomes wise, the almost go-to response is life experience. But of course, many people have life experience, and not all of them are wise. So there have to be additional variables or processes at play that intervene upon that relationship, that promote wisdom in some people, and in other people, a different developmental outcome. It could be happiness, it could be despair, it could be embitterment or something like that. And of course, we could make an argument that it's possible that these things can coexist within a particular person as well. So it's not like these are pathways that are mutually exclusive. I wanted to make that point. So asking the question then, why it is that some people develop wisdom and others don't. I've been very interested in this idea that came up earlier of self-reflection. If you look at this illustration that was made in the year 1509 in a text called the Book of Wisdom, you see here Lady Fortuna and Lady Sapientia. In other words, Lady Luck and Lady Wisdom. And I think the way that these ladies are depicted says a lot about what wisdom is and possibly how it develops. But I want to draw your attention specifically to Lady Wisdom, who's on the right. She's holding what's referred to as the mirror of wisdom. And in that mirror, she sees herself. Around that mirror, there are depictions of suns, moons, stars. While looking at herself, she's also not losing sight of the universe around her. So there's something special about the wise person's ability to reflect on life and themselves that may be characteristic of their wisdom, but also lead to their wisdom. So in my research program, the guiding questions I ask are, which type of life experience and how much of it is associated with the development of wisdom? How are different components of self-reflection related to wisdom? And does self-reflection influence the association between wisdom and life experience? And I've conducted a number of studies now looking at these questions from a different angles, and I'm going to be presenting some of the highlights of that research now. Before I do that, I want to say a couple things about my approach to studying wisdom. I should say that I looked at these questions across the lifespan with samples of older adults as well as younger. I use self-report questionnaires to measure wisdom, as well as performance tasks, like the one that we saw earlier, where people respond to dilemmas that are relevant to other people as well as themselves. To look at life experience, I've collected a life event checklist to look at the number of certain types of life events that people have encountered in their life course. I also collect people's autobiographical memories of certain types of life events that are theorized to be relevant to wisdom. So I've collected autobiographical memories of difficult life events, stressful life events, traumatic life events, turning point events, and wisdom fostering life events. And those memories are then scored or coded for self-reflective processes. So I also collect scales where people report on the ways in which they go about self-reflecting, but I also look at self-reflection as a behavior demonstrated in a written or spoken memory. In terms of characteristics of life experience that might be relevant to wisdom, I looked specifically at a life event's fundamentality. So how significant, core, or central it is to life and well-being versus how trivial or minor it is. I've looked at events' emotional valence. This has been strongly connected to wisdom because of cultural ideas like sadder but wiser. People become sadder but wiser, implying that they develop wisdom from experiencing hardship, that wisdom grows out of hardship. So I've looked at both positive and negative events, and I've also looked at how culturally normative events are. And this is related to emotional valence, but the idea that we have a certain life script that we're all living, this stereotypical or cultural life script that has certain events that occur at certain points over the life course. And wisdom might be stimulated or provoked by deviations from that script, because there's no obvious meaning associated with these disruptive events or deviant events, and people then need to do the hard work of understanding what they mean within the context of their lives. And that reflection, that requires reflection, and that reflection may lead to elevated levels of wisdom if done in a particular way. So what we've done with the life event checklist specifically is we've taken 102 life events that have been collected in other studies in the past that researchers have said these are important events to human development. I then had people come in and score those events for how fundamental they were, how emotionally positive or negative they were, and how culturally normative or non-normative they were. And then we looked at the number of events someone reported experiencing in relation to their level of wisdom. And what we found was that, by and large, even just experiencing a lot of these really important events over the life course is related to wisdom. It's related to wisdom in a linear fashion, so that the more life events that you have, the more wisdom you have, but also in a quadratic manner or a curvilinear manner. So that means that the people with the highest level of wisdom report experiencing a moderate to high number of life events rather than too few or too many. And then we look a little bit closer at the various characteristics and find that this curvilinear relationship exists in particular for experiencing a moderate number of negative or culturally non-normative events. So if you experience too many of these types of events in your life, you may be overwhelmed by them, and it's no longer a facilitative context or productive for the development of wisdom. But you also need a bit of adversity or non-normativity in order to stimulate those self-reflective processes that might lead to wisdom. The other surprising finding was that wisdom was strongly related to the experience of positive life events. And this is counterintuitive for many people because of these strong cultural notions surrounding the development of wisdom. And I'll talk later about some of the mechanisms that might describe how people grow from negative life events compared to positive life events. While I think that an argument could be made that the mechanisms that support that growth are similar, they're also different as well. When we asked people to report now, not on a checklist, but just tell us about an event that occurred in their life where they developed wisdom or think they have developed wisdom, what we would call a wisdom fostering event. People report, and then we took those memories and expert raters scored them for how fundamental they were, how emotionally positive or negative they were, and how normative or non-normative they were. We got this profile of a prototypical wisdom fostering event. These events are highly fundamental, emotionally negative, and culturally non-normative on average. When we looked at the specific types of events that were reported, we found that relationship events were reported most frequently. People reported developing wisdom from relationship events like divorce, interpersonal conflict, but sometimes positively valenced events as well, like dating or marriage. Life-threatening and mortality events, and events involving death or near-death experiences, illnesses, often led people to feel like they developed wisdom, as well as career and job-related events like job loss. We're going to look at a couple examples of these types of events now. So these, what I'm going to share with you now are 2 or 3 memories of wisdom fostering events reported by my participants, who were all midlife adults, but I mention the age of these people as I read them. And I've chosen these 3 examples because they illustrate differences among events reported. The first one that I'm going to read to you is a little tough to hear. It is an example of an event that has the prototypical characteristics. So it's fundamental, it's negative, emotionally, and culturally non-normative. But in this person's view, something that led to great wisdom for them. So this was reported by a 46-year-old woman from New York. She was 22 years old at the time of the event. She says, "It was the best, worst day of my life. Laying on the shower floor, bewildered, finding safety in the solitude as warm water rained over me. My fiance had come home after work. Things had been rocky for months, and he was increasingly more critical and controlling of everything I did. But expectations were mounting. Parents expected a wedding. There were wifely duties to be fulfilled, and I was failing at most turns. The cooking wasn't good enough. The apartment had to be spotless. There was no room for error. Frank arrived in a foul mood. We were meant to go out for a romantic evening. It was anything but. He answered the welcoming kiss by throwing me to the floor and assaulting me. In the horror of that moment, I woke up to the reality of who he truly was. The man I fell in love with was a fiction, an illusion of who he wanted to be. Who I wanted him to be was shattered. The reality of him sneering insults with his knee grinding into my back and the carpet burning my face was an angry bully. Petty, small. I managed to reel free, pulled my knees to my chest, sitting up like a fortified stone. I quietly growled, "You will never touch me again." He left, and I sat there alone, still hugging my knees against my naked chest as the afternoon light gave way to dusk and darkness. Eventually, I crawled into the shower sobbing, finding solace in the warm water and steam that caressed and soothed. For months, he had criticized relentlessly and tried to break my spirit. He peeled me like a rose and found nothing there. That night, he tried to break me physically. Ironically, in his effort to destroy me, he made me stronger. In making me more submissive, I became more independent. In that moment, I found me. So this is very emblematic of the growth storyline that many people report from hardship. And there's a key word in this narrative, and that is shattered. So one of the explanations for why an event like this might lead to a development of wisdom is that this person's assumptions about their world were shattered or disrupted by this really significant event. And when our expectations are shattered, we have to go through a process of rebuilding. And in Piagetian or constructivist terms, he would talk about this as an event that produced disequilibrium. And because humans are predisposed to feel integrated and whole, we need to repair the schemes that we have of our lives that have been disrupted. And when we repair those schemes, in this case, we hopefully have a clearer sense of reality, one that isn't cynical or bitter, although that might be part of the developmental process, but one that still maintains a degree of positivity. There is an aspect of finding a silver lining in this event, even though that process of reflecting on the event may be quite emotionally difficult from the outset. And in a moment, I'll show you about a different way of processing this that isn't as deep and is less likely to lead to wisdom. I'm going to just mention this event because it demonstrates that some individuals develop wisdom from highly positive events. This is an event that has to do with the birth of her son, this woman's son. And she described this event as an awesome event. It was awe-inspiring. And one of the explanations for why people who experience positive events develop wisdom is because of this state of awe, which opens up temporarily people's minds to new possibilities. And I also want to impress upon you that while this is a highly positive event, it's not challenge-free. Becoming a parent can still disrupt expectations of life in a sense, in a more mundane sense, even on the day-to-day, the everyday level, but still may sort of provide people pause and require some sort of reconstruction of expectations. Other researchers talk about, in contrast to post-traumatic growth, post-ecstatic growth, which is a really interesting concept, that positive events can be maybe not equally, but also growth promoting. I want to read you this narrative, which is an example of a very trivial, non-fundamental life event that led to great wisdom in the reporter. And this is my favorite narrative from a data set of 502. So this 50-year-old man from Kansas, who was 12 years old at the time of the events, said the following: "The day I gained wisdom is very clear to me. A very short episode that has stuck with me for years and years. My dad and I were fishing at the river without luck. We were there forever, it seemed. We had some really good poles and we were casting them out to good spots. There were no bites. After we had been there for a bit, this little older black lady climbed the dike and walked down all the giant rocks to the riverbank and started fishing next to us. She asked how the fishing was, and my dad was like, 'No good today.' She had a bamboo pole with a very short line. She started fishing only 5 or 6 feet from shore, and I'll be damned if she didn't start pulling in catfish right and left, while my dad and I were fishing with no luck whatsoever, even with our fancy poles. My dad asked her at one point how in the heck she was having so much luck and we weren't. Her answer has stuck in my head for years. She said, 'If you want to catch a fish, you have to know where to put the worm.' Even then I knew that was deep. I felt I was going to be unstoppable. I'm not sure if I can say we became better fishermen from that, but that phrase has echoed in my head and helped me make more than one decision in my life. It is a litmus test for choosing what, where, and when to make important moves." So while I've been suggesting that life experience is the sort of stimulant, catalyst, and subject matter for the development of wisdom, there's clearly, and in ordinary circumstances, those are negative events, challenging events in some way. This is a very mundane event. But there's something, therefore, about this person that allowed him to extract wisdom from a very simple event, and very deep wisdom that had long-lasting effects. So let's talk for a few moments then about self-reflection. This, I would argue, is a person who is likely deeply self-reflective. What I've found when using self-report questionnaires that ask questions about people's tendencies in self-reflection is that wisdom, not surprisingly, is highly, in some cases highly, but almost always positively associated with facets of self-reflection, such as the frequency of engagement in self-reflection, simply how often we think back about ourselves and our life. There's a star, an asterisk beside this point, because that's not always, that's not a reliable finding necessarily, and that makes sense. My argument would be that it's not about how much you reflect, but how you reflect. Wisdom is also positively associated with the motivational need for self-reflection. Wise people feel the need to reflect. It's also associated with the self-perceived insight gained through reflection. Wise people report gaining insight from looking back on the past. And importantly, wisdom is associated with productive and adaptive forms of self-reflection, as opposed to forms of self-reflection that we usually think are negative, like rumination. In fact, wisdom was unrelated to rumination, which is a sort of brooding, dwelling on the negative aspects of the past. It's unrelated, and I want to explore in my future research the possibility that a short or relatively prolonged period of rumination is actually really important to the development of wisdom. That people sit with their negative emotions as they experience them fully and explore them for deeper meaning. This is a pretty complex figure, which I'll just try to provide the highlights of. But Ursula Staudinger, a lifespan developmentalist, proposed that there are two ways in which wise people reflect. Not only do they remember an event well, they reconstruct it in their mind, they also analyze it for deeper meaning. And this is what my research program has been testing. So what I do is I collect people's memories, I look at how well they remember it by measuring how coherent the memories are, and I also look at how well they're analyzing it by measuring certain forms of self-reflective processing. Specifically, what I look at are two forms of processing, which we've called exploratory processing versus redemptive processing. Exploratory processing is a way of looking back on the past that emphasizes making meaning from the past, extracting or deriving deep insights and lessons that can be applied to future situations. Redemptive processing, however, is about taking a negative event primarily and transforming it so that it has a positive meaning. And that in turn allows people to seek closure. So redemptive processing is about learning a quick lesson, perhaps, a quick silver lining that allows a person to move on from negative emotions as opposed to sit with them and explore them more deeply. And the outcomes of those processes are different. So what we found was that moving to the bottom of this slide, exploratory processing, but not redemptive processing, was correlated positively with wisdom, which we might think of as a growth pathway. And redemptive processing, not exploratory processing, was positively correlated with psychological adjustment. So, which we call the adjustment pathway. This means that the way in which you sort of direct your attention, or the way in which you self-reflect while looking back on the past, may have consequences for the long-term developmental outcomes associated with that. I could also reverse that and say that better adjusted people tend to reflect in certain ways, and wiser people tend to reflect in certain ways. Let's imagine for a second that the self-reflection actually is the determinant of the outcome. People who are looking to simply redeem an event, learn a quick lesson, and transform a negative to positive, I could argue that that is a relatively defensive way of self-reflecting, but at the same time adaptive. These people aren't sitting with their negative emotion for long, but are functioning quite well later. People on the growth pathway, the exploratory processing is less defensive because it means that you must confront negative emotion and the disrupted expectations of your life. From there, you construct wisdom, which ultimately is also good. And wisdom, in the long run, is connected to predictive of well-being. So these are both pathways to well-being, but they may look different. And this is what we're probing further with research. And finally, I wanted to show two slides that actually make the point that it's neither life experience nor self-reflection necessarily by themselves that predict wisdom, although both do. Wisdom is uniquely predicted by the combination of the two. So in this figure, what you see is that individuals who are highly reflective and experience a high number of negative events in life demonstrate the highest levels of wisdom. People who have experienced a high number of negative life events but are unreflective about those have the lowest levels of wisdom. So it's the interaction of life experience and self-reflection that might create elevated levels of wisdom. And another way of looking at that would be to correlate aspects of the memories that people provided with how people reflect on them. And what we find is that people remember negative events and culturally non-normative events in a more coherent manner, and they have deeper or more levels of meaning making, or they reference insights and lessons gained in more frequently and in more complex ways. So these types of life events might pull for that deep type of self-reflection, which then might lead to wisdom. So again, it's an aspect of the event that's pulling for a certain psychological process, in this case, deep self-reflection, that might predict the development of wisdom. So to conclude, some of the questions that I've been asking myself and will continue to ask are, is self-reflection an antecedent, correlate, or defining characteristic of wisdom? Which comes first? Does self-reflection lead to wisdom, or is wisdom or self-reflection just something wise people do? Can this type of exploratory processing be trained? What do we want to? We think about people who are trying to make sense of difficult life events. Do we want them to explore the deeper meaning of those events? Or do we want to encourage something more like redemptive processing? The question. Certainly, either of those outcomes is better than an approach to self-reflection that fosters bitterness, something like that. I've already mentioned the role of rumination. Current research that I'm doing is looking at the actual content of the lessons and insights that wise people have gleaned from the past. So not just, we know that they glean more insight and derive more lessons, and again, that they're more complex and elaborate, but what do they know? What have wise people learned from the past that might help all of us to live better lives? So right now we're actually looking at the content of that meaning. And then finally, as Esme mentioned earlier, I'm engaging in a project where we're exploring intergenerational storytelling between grandparents and grandchildren in a community sample, but also in a sample in Austria of a Slovenian minority that lives in the south of Austria that has been heavily persecuted in that region. And we're looking at the different ways in which storytelling is used to support growth in grandchildren. So taking that from a cultural perspective, as well as an intergenerational one. Okay, with that, thank you for listening to me just talk at you for a long time. We have some time for questions, thankfully. First, I'd like to just acknowledge the people I have on the screen here. These are my mentors as well as the collaborators of the research that I've been working on. I've included my contact information if you're interested in receiving any of the publications that I've talked about so far. And this is also on the website for the Institute for Life Course and Aging under the, I'm listed as one of the Institute members, so you can find me there as well. And thank you for being so attentive. Now please, ask questions, comment. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting to think about wisdom in terms of grandfather or your college mentor or someone like that, of ordinary. But I think it's a little difficult when you talk about those historical figures, because if you talk 4 or 5, I'm not sure the 5th one, 5 of the figures who were most wise were assassinated and in the middle of their lives. And whether they were wise, what they were assassinated for was because they took uncompromising positions on moral issues. Jim Crow is wrong, caste system is wrong, slavery is wrong, and they got killed for it. So, and I don't know if it's possible to apply the quantitative method to those historical situations, but when we talk about the wisdom of people that we actually know can we rely on, I think we're on safer ground. I'm happy to find out in a way personally, how do I become more wise and how do I recognize wisdom in those around me?
I completely agree with that. I'm much more interested in, extraordinary wisdom demonstrated by ordinary people than these historical figures. That project was really more just for interest's sake. I was curious to know who people would nominate as wise. Now, it is connected though to ordinary wisdom because people often emulate these cultural historical figures, right? So what they see wise in some of these figures may have a direct influence on how they exercise or apply wisdom in their own lives. So there is, I think, a connection there. And an excellent observation. Many of the exemplars nominated could be considered martyrs or died for their cause. And again, good question. Is that wise? In the minds of the people nominating them, yes, that was used in their justification for why they were wise. They were so self-sacrificial that somehow was actually indicative of wisdom. But anyway, so that was a really interesting study. And as you say, I think we need to look, though, more at a local level and people around us. How do we, on an everyday level, express our wisdom and develop it? Okay, yes, Claudia.
I had this conversation with my 7-year-old son about wisdom and the difference between smart and wise. And one of the things that I sort of think about wisdom is the ability to think and reflect and make an independent decision to do what is ultimately right, independent of what surrounds you. So I just all these people.
There is a relationship between wisdom and intelligence. That's not always observed in studies. Sometimes there is no correlation, but in other cases there is.
I'm not saying that they do.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that people that being wise actually have that ability of
Yes.
what you say, reflecting
Yes.
and also making
Yeah.
a decision based on what is seemingly right as opposed
Yeah.
to, so it's kind of independently being able to think through an issue and not be.
Exactly. So there's a threshold of intelligence maybe that's required to think complexly in the way that you're describing. Bob Sternberg has talked recently about smart fools, right? You can be smart without being wise, and he's talking a lot about obviously what's going on to the south of us in terms of the leadership in the United States, but it's possible perhaps to be highly intelligent, cunning, and even clever without being wise, and that would be an example of a smart fool. We need more smart and wise leaders.
Shakespearean. Just to be quick about so this whole topic that you're talking about, from my perspective as a more mature individual, I experienced a lot of events in my life that slightly related to illness, people, family, loved ones, and you learn from those ill events, and they're not happy events. But it also depends on the subject, the person that can ask for help, because I'm surrounded by good friends who are social workers, and they supported me through these life events. And I have to say that I ask for help. And there are people that don't know how to ask for help. And I think sometimes having the help around you or your friends, it helps you do that self-reflection.
Yes.
Because sometimes you might not have that support system.
Absolutely, and this is very underdeveloped in the psychological research on wisdom. So first of all, part of wisdom is humility, right? So knowing when to ask for help and being open to that help. But what we haven't done a good job of is understanding the social resources that help facilitate the development of wisdom. We've done lots by way of the personal or like individual resources, but not the social. And actually the researcher I'm working with in Austria is very much interested in that line of research. So that's still underdeveloped, but hopefully next time I'll have more to report in that area. Thank you.
So I'm going to, just because it's 1 and I know some people have to run off, I wanted to give you one more round of applause. It was fabulous.